Well, hello there. It's Scott Winteroff from ContentAcademy.com, and in this lesson, we're going to talk about image types. You've probably used them all: GIF, JPEG, and PNG, the royal court of images, if you will. But we're going to talk about what each individual image type does and why you'd use one over the other. Most importantly, I'm going to give you some practical advice of which one you would use for your blogging and content strategy. So let's dive right in. Okay, the first one I want to talk about is GIFs. Now, they're pronounced GIF, but popular culture has turned them into GIFs, particularly with internet memes and stuff like that. So I'm going to go with GIF, but really they're actually called GIFs if you didn't know. But GIFs are used primarily for images that require animation. There are several pros and cons to both. But most importantly, a GIF would be used when you need to create some type of animation. That's why the jack is jumping up and down here. That represents the animation feature of a GIF, right? The biggest sort of pro of using one. Now, the reason why you might use a GIF for animation is that sometimes you want your animation to be very cross-browser compatible. So, for example, on one of my websites, I use a GIF that was a video file, because the video files like the .movs or the .m4vs don't always play on every single device. They might play well on a desktop, but they don't work so great on mobile devices. So sometimes I will use a GIF in replacement to a video file on a website if I'm looking to create some type of video animation. Of course, it depends on what you're doing. Also, GIFs can get really large really quickly, because at the end of the day, with a GIF, you're basically taking several different frames or several different images and turning them into one image. So a GIF can get really large really quickly. So I recommend using GIFs only for really, really short, repeatable, or loopable animations. Like, for example, with my jack who's jumping up and down, right? It's just a looping animation. It's about 6 different frames to create this. The biggest advantage is that you can create animations that are cross-browser compatible, and also this file, the image files, support transparency. So you can you can show the background through, which we'll talk more about transparency as we get to PNGs. But ultimately, you use a GIF for JPEGs. The disadvantages to JPEGs is that they don't support a lot of compression, so they get really large, as I already mentioned, and it's not the most supported file format either. It's supported more than most, but it's not actually the most supported file format type compared to devices. All right, the next one I want to talk about is the Queen PNG, right? PNGs, or PNGs, are basically a file format that you can use to create images and graphics that require transparency. So you'll notice here the Queen deck card, if you will, is not white, but it's green because the background color is showing through due to the opacity. The cool thing about PNGs, not only do they provide transparency, but it actually provides the ability to create levels of transparency. So if you want 0% to 25% to 86% to 100% transparency, you can create that. So if you want less transparency to create that opacity, then you can do that with PNGs. Another cool feature is that they don't lose fidelity every time you save them. This might not be something you run into a lot, but basically, with like a copy machine, if you take a piece of paper and you start Xeroxing it over and over again, it starts to lose fidelity after you keep changing out the original for a copy, right? So PNG supposedly don't do that. If you can keep resaving it without losing fidelity, which is a nice feature if you are trying to make sure you keep your files nice and up to date, which you'd want to. Also, this is sort of a not super important to everyday users, but the tools that were created to set up PNGs or to make them publicly available are patent-free, which is nice. So that means that no one really technically owns the technology. It's just an open web type feature that allows everyone to use PNGs. And most importantly, they're ideal for graphics and drawings or logos, which we'll talk about a little bit more as I get into the web applications of each individual images. Now, the bad news about PNGs is that they often are a little larger file size than over a JPEG, if you will, because JPEGs support the most compression, which I'll talk about next. And also, they don't support animation. So if you're looking to create like a little animation or a little meme, if you will, you couldn't use a PNG for that. and it's not really ideal for full color resolution images. So if you take an image on your vacation, like for example the Eiffel Tower, maybe you're in Paris, you wouldn't probably want to use a PNG for that image file type because of all the different colors aren't supported with PNG. Now let's go to the king of the court, if you will, the JPEG. JPEGs have been around forever. They are basically the most known because they are supported by every single device. Your phone probably takes images in JPEGs, right? And the reason why they do that is because JPEGs provide the most compression that allows you to create the best photo possible without a lot of extra fat in terms of pixels and stuff like that. So it provides the most compression to take up less space on your device, whether that's your phone or your website server. And you really can optimize the image to your final application needs. Basically, it's best for photographs like that would accompany a blog post, or a photograph that doesn't require that transparency to match the background layer. So for example, if you have a logo that has a white background, but your background header of your website is white, it could work because the whites and whites will match. But if you have a logo that doesn't match, then you'll have to use a PNG for that file format. Also, JPEGs support up to 16 million colors, so it's ideal for photos that require lots of different colors. The disadvantages are same as a couple of the other ones. There's no transparency, no animations, and you can overcompress JPEGs to the point where they look a little grainy, right? You'll also notice in my example here with the king card is that the corners are not rounded, they're squared, right? With the queen, the corners were rounded because you can create that transparency, but with JPEGs, you can't do rounded corners. There are really only two types of file sizes, if you will, or aspect ratios when it comes to images. You can either do a square or a rectangle. If you aren't using a square or a rectangle, you have to use transparency in order to create that. That's why JPEGs and PNGs provide that level of transparency. So you can do round images or circles or triangles or whatever. You can't really do that technically with a JPEG unless you want to have the background as part of that particular image or graphic. JPEGs are ideal for images. PNGs are generally ideal for graphics or other type of logos where you need to have that transparency at the most part. Here's an example, a real world example. Here's a photo of Joan and I. You'll notice in the one photo there is the background to it, and that's obviously a JPEG because it has to have the background and it is a square or a rectangle, if you will, right? And then the other image, I've cut out the background using Photoshop, and I'll show you an example. Here's the photo in Photoshop with the background removed, right? And that way, with the background removed, we can create this transparent type image that can be used as nicely for graphics on a website or anything like that where we want that particular transparency. And in summary, basically there are three types of media: JPEGs, PNGs, and GIFs. JPEGs are the king of the court. You use them most often because they provide the most compression level and they have the most colors and they will save the most space on your website. If you take photos on your phone in high resolution levels, you want to make sure you reduce that file size down to be something that's adequate for web resolution. I have a special download on how to do that in the show notes of this particular video. Be sure to check that out. Also, I created an entire episode on how to maximize your blog's images by reducing the file size. And that's episode number 39 of the Blog You Want in the Time You Have podcast, starring me, and you can find that at blogyouwant.com. This actual tutorial is an accompaniment to that episode, so you'll hear a little bit of me bouncing back and forth between the two, so definitely go check that out. And finally, PNGs and GIFs are ideal for logos, and GIFs are ideal for animations. So be sure to make sure that you use the right file type while you're blogging and content marketing, because that will help save a world of hurt when your website is fast and your server is not overloaded with high-resolution images. You won't have to pay for extra work, and ultimately, your website will load super fast, which is good for search engine optimization, which is good for overall user experience. So do what you can to reduce the images on your website. If you want more resources, definitely go check out my blog, my podcast episode on that. And thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to this channel if you'd like to get more tutorials on how to maximize your content marketing and content strategy efforts. And I appreciate you watching.